Your life is decided before 7 a.m., and most people don't even know it. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Michael Carter opened his eyes to the same cracked ceiling he had stared at for years, the faint hum of a broken fan struggling above him, his phone buzzing with missed alarms he had already ignored. And for a moment he just lay there, not moving, not thinking, just feeling that quiet, familiar weight pressing down on his chest, the kind that doesn't come from exhaustion but from knowing nothing is really changing. That today will look exactly like yesterday, and yesterday looked exactly like the day before that. And somewhere deep inside, a question whispered louder than ever. Is this it? Maybe you've felt that too, that strange mix of being tired without doing anything meaningful, of watching other people move forward while you stay stuck in the same place. Telling yourself you'll start tomorrow, you'll change next week, you'll figure it out soon. But soon keeps getting pushed further away, and life keeps moving anyway. Because here's the truth no one likes to admit. Most people don't fail because they're lazy. They fail because they never change the one moment that actually matters. And Michael didn't know it yet. But his entire life was about to split into two different versions. One where he kept hitting snooze and stayed exactly where he was. And another where everything began at a time most people never see, 5 a.m. Because somewhere across the city, while lights were still off and streets were still empty, another version of him already existed, sitting quietly at a small table, a cheap cup of coffee in his hands, a notebook open in front of him, learning, planning, building something invisible, something no one could applaud yet. And the only difference between these two lives wasn't talent, it wasn't luck, it wasn't connections, it was one decision made in the dark, when the alarm rang and no one was watching. When comfort said stay and something deeper said get up, and the hardest part wasn't the work, it was that first moment, that silent battle between who you are and who you could become. And right now, whether you realize it or not, you're standing in that same moment. Because tomorrow morning, when your alarm goes off, there will be two versions of you waiting, and only one of them will change everything. Michael Carter was not lazy, and that was the part that made it hurt more, because every night he came home exhausted from a 10-hour shift as a night security guard at a warehouse on the edge of the city, walking the same silent halls under flickering lights, checking the same doors, signing the same reports, telling himself he was working hard, that things would get better eventually. But eventually never came, and each morning when his shift ended at 6, he would step outside into a world that was just waking up, people in clean shirts heading to offices, coffee shops filling with energy, sunlight touching buildings like something new was beginning. But for him, it was the opposite, because his day was already over before it even felt like it started. And by the time he reached his small apartment, his body would collapse onto a thin mattress on the floor, shoes still on, phone slipping from his hand, and he would sleep through the hours. When life actually moved forward, waking up sometime in the late afternoon, disoriented, heavy, already behind, promising himself that tonight would be different, that he would study, that he would learn something new, that he would apply for better jobs. But when night came, the same cycle repeated, and deep down he knew the truth he did not want to say out loud. It was not that he lacked effort. It was that his effort was trapped in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and the results showed it. His bank account barely covered rent. His meals were cheap and repetitive. His clothes were worn thin. And every call from his mother carried the same quiet question, when will your life change? And he always answered the same way, soon. Even though soon had meant the same thing for years, and maybe you understand that feeling. When you are doing everything you think you are supposed to do, working hard, staying busy, pushing through fatigue, but nothing seems to move, nothing seems to open. And the gap between where you are and where you want to be only feels wider with time. Because that was Michael's real struggle, not physical exhaustion, but the slow realization that hard work alone was not enough, that something invisible was missing, something he could not name yet, something that separated the life he was living from the life he imagined. And every single day that passed without change made that question louder. How long can you keep going like this before you accept that this is all there is? Every night Michael told himself the same story, that tomorrow would be different, that tomorrow he would finally take control, finally break out, finally become the person he knew he could be. But tomorrow always arrived looking exactly like yesterday, and the pattern became so familiar it almost felt normal. Waking up late in the afternoon with a dry throat and a heavy head, scrolling through his phone while the sunlight faded outside his window, seeing other people posting about promotions, new apartments, trips, milestones, lives that seemed to be moving somewhere, while his felt stuck in place, and he would sit there thinking, I am not less capable than them. I am not less intelligent. So why does it feel like I am standing still while everyone else moves forward? And that question followed him everywhere, into his shifts at night, into the quiet moments between checking doors, into the long walks through empty hallways where the only sound was his own footsteps echoing back at him. Because the hardest part was not the work, it was the silence, the space where his thoughts had nowhere to hide. And in that silence he began to notice something he had ignored for years. It was not just what he was doing, it was when he was doing it. Because while he worked through the night, the world slept. And when the world woke up, when opportunities moved, when conversations happened, when decisions were made, he was asleep, disconnected, out of sync, living in reverse. And the more he thought about it, the more it unsettled him, because it meant that all his effort, all his discipline, all his endurance were being spent in hours that did not build anything beyond survival. And survival was all he had been doing for years, surviving. Each day, surviving each paycheck, surviving each month, telling himself that staying afloat was enough. But deep down he knew it was not, because there is a difference between staying alive and actually moving forward. And Michael could feel that difference growing heavier inside him, like a quiet pressure that would not go away, a sense that something was fundamentally wrong, not with who he was, but with how he was living. And once that realization started, it did not leave. It followed him into the next morning, and the next, until one question became impossible to ignore. What if it is not about working harder, but about choosing a different moment to live your life? The question did not leave Michael alone. It followed him into a cold Tuesday morning as he stepped off the bus just after sunrise, the sky painted in soft orange and pale blue, the kind of morning most people rushed through without noticing. But for him it felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the world was moving forward without him again. And he stood there for a moment watching people walk past with purpose, coffee in hand, conversations already started, lives already in motion, and something inside him tightened, not with anger, not with envy, but with a strange clarity he had never felt before, because for the first time he could see it clearly. He was not just tired, he was out of alignment with his own life, and that realization did not come as a loud breakthrough. It came as a quiet discomfort that refused to go away. And later that day, back in his apartment, sitting on the edge of his mattress with his phone in his hand, scrolling through the same endless stream of distractions, he suddenly stopped, not because something on the screen caught his attention, but because nothing did. And in that silence the question returned again, stronger than before. What if nothing changes? Not next month, not next year, not 5 years from now. What if this is it? And for a moment he tried to push it away like he always did, telling himself he just needed rest, just needed time, just needed one lucky break. But the thought would not leave. It stayed there, steady and uncomfortable, forcing him to look at something he had avoided for years. That no one was coming to change his life for him. That no opportunity was going to magically appear while he stayed in the same routine, the same hours, the same patterns, and the weight of that truth settled in slowly, not crushing, but undeniable, because it meant that if his life was going to change, something about him had to change first. Not his job, not his situation, but the way he showed up to his own time. And that night, as he prepared for another shift, tying his worn shoes and stepping out into the dimly lit street, he felt something unfamiliar, not motivation, not excitement, but a quiet decision forming beneath the surface, a sense that he could not continue living the same day over and over again. And as he walked through the long, silent corridors of the warehouse hours later, checking doors, hearing his footsteps echo in the emptiness, he realized that the real breaking point was not losing everything. It was realizing he had been losing time, day after day, without ever questioning it. And once you see that, once you truly see it, you cannot unsee it. And that is the moment when everything begins to change. It happened on a morning that looked no different from any other. But for the first time, Michael did not rush past it, because as he stepped out of the warehouse after his shift, the air felt colder, sharper, and the sky was just beginning to lighten. That quiet moment between night and day when the world feels suspended, and instead of heading straight home like he always did, he stopped, watching as a few early risers moved with intention, a man jogging down the street, a woman unlocking a small coffee shop, lights turning on one by one, and something about that scene held him in place, because these people were not rushing. They were starting, and for the first time he noticed that there was a window of time he had never truly seen before, a space where the world had not yet demanded anything from you, where no one was calling, no messages were coming in, no noise was pulling your attention away, just quiet, just possibility. And as he stood there, a memory surfaced, something a coworker had mentioned weeks ago, almost casually, about how successful people protect their mornings like it is the most important part of their day, and at the time Michael had dismissed it, telling himself that was not realistic for someone in his situation. But now, standing in that stillness, it felt different. It felt like a missing piece, and later that day, instead of collapsing immediately into bed, he sat down at his small table, pulled out an old notebook he had not touched in months, and wrote one simple question: what if the problem is not my effort, but when I use it? And he stared at those words for a long time, because they carried a weight he could not ignore, and slowly, almost reluctantly, an idea began to form, not a grand plan, not a complicated system, just one small shift. What if he claimed those early hours instead of sleeping through them? What if he stopped living in reverse and started aligning himself with the part of the day where life actually begins? And the thought was both simple and uncomfortable, because it meant giving up what little comfort he had. It meant choosing discipline over exhaustion, clarity over habit. And as the evening approached, and he prepared for another shift, that idea stayed with him, quiet but persistent. And by the time he returned home the next morning, just before dawn, he did something he had never done before. He did not go straight to bed. He sat down, poured himself a cheap cup of coffee, opened that same notebook, and for the first time in years, he stayed awake, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And in that moment, without fully understanding it yet, Michael had just stepped into a different version of his life. The first morning felt almost unreal, like stepping into a life that did not belong to him. Because as Michael sat there with his coffee growing cold in his hands, the silence around him was different from anything he had known before. It was not the silence of exhaustion at the end of a long shift. It was the silence of a beginning. But that did not make it easy, because within minutes his body began to protest. His eyes burned, his head felt heavy, and every instinct told him to lie down, to rest, to return to what was familiar. And the voice in his mind grew louder with each passing second, saying, "This is not sustainable. You need sleep. You can start tomorrow." And for a moment he almost listened. His hand even moved slightly as if to close the notebook and give up. But then something stopped him. Not motivation, not excitement, just a quiet memory of that question he had written the day before. What if the problem is when I use my effort? And he realized that this, right here, was the real test. Not learning something new, not building a skill, but choosing to stay when everything in him wanted to leave. And so he stayed, even if it was just for a few more minutes. And those minutes turned into 30, then an hour, and he did not accomplish anything extraordinary. He read a few pages, wrote down a few thoughts, tried to focus and failed more than once. But when the clock moved forward and the sun rose higher, something subtle had shifted, because for the first time in years, he had used his time before the world took it from him. And that feeling stayed with him throughout the day, quiet but undeniable, until the next morning came, and the alarm rang again. And this time it was harder, because now he knew what it required. He knew the discomfort, the resistance, the weight of choosing differently. And there was no excitement left, only a decision, and he did not always win. Some mornings he gave in. Some mornings he chose sleep, telling himself he deserved it. But the difference was that now he was aware of the choice, aware of the cost, and slowly, over days and then weeks, a pattern began to form. Not perfect, not consistent, but real, because each time he chose to get up, even when it felt pointless, even when it felt small, he was reinforcing something deeper than discipline. He was proving to himself that he could act differently than before, and that proof, repeated enough times, began to change the way he saw himself, not as someone stuck, not as someone waiting, but as someone who could move. Even if the movement was slow, even if no one else could see it yet at first, nothing around Michael seemed to change. The warehouse was still the same. The long silent nights, the flickering lights, the same routine repeating over and over. But something inside him had shifted in a way that was hard to explain, because now, when he walked those empty halls, he no longer felt completely stuck. He felt like he was in motion, even if that motion was invisible to everyone else. And that was the strange part. No one noticed. His coworkers saw the same man, tired, quiet, doing his job. His landlord saw the same tenant paying rent late. The world treated him exactly the same. But Michael knew something they did not, because every morning, before the sun fully rose, he was building something piece by piece, hour by hour, and slowly those hours began to add up. The notes in his notebook grew longer, the ideas became clearer, the distractions lost some of their power, and one morning, while sitting at that same small table, he realized something that stopped him for a moment. He was no longer forcing himself to stay awake. He was choosing to, and that difference changed everything. Because what had once felt like discipline now started to feel like direction, and with that direction came a quiet confidence, not loud, not visible, but steady, the kind that does not come from results, but from knowing you are finally doing something that matters. And it showed in small ways first, in the way he carried himself, in the way he spoke, in the way he started to look at opportunities differently, because now he was not just reacting to life, he was preparing for it. And that is when the shift truly began. Not with a big moment, not with a sudden breakthrough, but with a realization that crept in slowly, that while most people were waiting for the right time, he had already started creating it, and the hours he once wasted were now becoming his advantage. Because every morning he woke up before the world asked anything of him, he gained something no one could take away: clarity, focus, control, and the more he experienced that, the harder it became to go back to who he was before. Because once you feel what it is like to move forward, even slowly, standing still no longer feels comfortable. It feels unbearable. And that is when the real change begins, not when your life looks different on the outside, but when staying the same becomes impossible on the inside. The changes did not arrive all at once. They came quietly, almost unnoticed, like small shifts in the background of a life that had once felt completely still. Because after a few weeks of waking early, Michael began to see patterns he had never seen before. Ideas that once felt confusing started to make sense. Skills he struggled with began to improve, and opportunities that used to pass him by unnoticed suddenly stood out. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. And that difference showed itself in moments that seemed small on the surface but carried a deeper meaning. Like the day his supervisor asked if anyone wanted to help with a new system being introduced at the warehouse. Something most people ignored because it meant extra effort without immediate reward. But Michael said yes without hesitation, not because he was certain it would change anything, but because he was no longer avoiding growth. And over the next few weeks, that decision led to conversations. Those conversations led to trust, and that trust led to responsibility. And for the first time in years, he was no longer invisible. And outside of work, the same pattern continued. The early mornings became a space where he studied consistently, not perfectly, but enough to build real progress. And slowly, almost without realizing it, he started applying for different roles, speaking with more clarity, presenting himself differently, because now he had something he did not have before: evidence. Evidence that he could commit, that he could follow through, that he could change, and that evidence changed the way others saw him. But more importantly, it changed the way he saw himself. And months later, when he received an offer for a better position, one that aligned with the skills he had been building in those quiet hours before sunrise, it did not feel like luck. It felt like the result of something he had been quietly constructing all along. And even then, the biggest transformation was not the job, not the income, not the external changes. It was the fact that he no longer felt stuck. Because once you experience what it is like to create movement in your own life, you understand that progress is not something that happens to you. It is something you build, one decision at a time, often in moments no one else ever sees. And for Michael, it all traced back to those early hours, the ones he used to sleep through, the ones he once believed did not matter, until they became the very foundation of everything that came after. 1 year later, the alarm still rings before sunrise, but everything else is different. not in a dramatic, overnight way, but in the quiet, steady way that real change happens. Because Michael no longer wakes up feeling like his life is slipping away, he wakes up knowing he is building something. And the small apartment with the broken fan has been replaced with a space that feels earned. The long nights at the warehouse are no longer his only path, and the version of himself that once felt stuck now feels in motion. But if you looked closely, if you traced every step back to where it began, you would not find a big breakthrough. You would not find a moment of luck. You would not find some hidden advantage. You would find something much simpler, a decision made in the dark, repeated over and over again until it became part of who he was. Because that is the part most people misunderstand. They think change happens when life gets easier, when motivation appears, when the right moment finally arrives. But this story shows something different. It shows that change begins when you choose differently in the same conditions, when you take the hours that used to pass unnoticed and give them purpose. When you stop waiting for your life to start and begin it yourself. And maybe that is the real lesson here. Not that waking up early magically solves everything, but that there is a part of your day, a quiet window where no one is asking anything from you, where no one is watching, where no one is judging, and what you do in that space slowly shapes everything that follows. Because the difference between the life Michael lived before and the life he lives now was not talent. It was not intelligence. It was not luck. It was how he used his time when it mattered most. And if you think about it, that same moment exists for you too. Not somewhere in the future, not when conditions are perfect, but tomorrow morning, when the alarm goes off and the room is still dark, and in that moment, there will be two versions of you again, the one who stays, and the one who gets up. And the story you just heard is not about Michael. It is about what happens when one of those versions becomes real.